sure everybody has.
Just also to say, si jamais il y a des gens ici qui ont besoin de poser des questions en français, c'est absolument bienvenu. Nous pourrions le traiter, pas de problème. Okay, so Benoit, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to do two things. First, a series of thank yous that are in order, and then a little bit of contextual introduction before I pass the virtual mic over to Kat, who's going to tell you very interesting things. I know that for sure. So my list of thank yous, the first one is the Radical Independence Campaign for inviting me to their founding meeting in 2012 and then again in 2014 to represent Quebec Solidaire over there. That was a great experience, and that's where the idea of Kat being here with us right now came from. And of course, on the other side of it, Quebec Solidaire for getting on board with that project and actually paying for it, which is significant. And especially a special mention to two people in Quebec Solidaire, Andrés Fontesia, who's the current president of the party, and André Frappier, also a member of the coordinating committee, who both worked on organizing the international panel that Kat spoke at Friday night. Also, the Québec Solidaire people in Outaouais, donc les gens de Québec Solidaire ici dans la région d'Outaouais, et aussi le réseau socialiste qui va participer à la diffusion de l'événement. Of course, Solidarity against Austerity, who, yay, Solidarity against Austerity! Yeah, which crowd I'm speaking to right now, for endorsing and helping to organize the event, especially Kevin Scarrett for finding us this warm and yeah,
there's beer here.
Yeah, well, yeah. You know, it's a nice space, especially considering that it's there's the big Congress going on this week, and we couldn't find space anywhere else. So let's all enjoy this one. And Jessica Squires, who's going to be facilitating the discussion, for her help tonight, but also more broadly in organizing Kat's little mini tour of Quebec and a little part of Ontario, parts of Quebec and Ontario. You know, maybe next time we can do a 7 cities thing, or, but not this time. And finally, of course, I have to thank Kat Boyd, who's one of the leading voices in the Radical Independence Campaign and also the Scottish Left Project, a group that aims at uniting the Scottish Left for a new electoral alliance. She's going to tell you all about that. And for her hard work participating, and I actually don't know precisely how many events over the past 6 days. So thanks a lot for that work. Just to mention, if you don't already know, Kat is a union activist, a feminist. She contributes in various ways to the political debate in Scotland. And she wrote with a friend of hers a book called Scottish Independence, A Feminist Response. Good luck finding one. They've all been sold, so they have to do a second edition sometime soon. So that was the thank yous. And now I'm going to give you a little bit of general context for those who are not familiar with what we're discussing this evening, which is current politics in Scotland. There has only been a Scottish Parliament for 16 years, and it was the result of the devolution of power from the Westminster Parliament to 3 regional, or more or less national, governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. At the time, Tony Blair was the Labour Prime Minister in Westminster. And at that time, in the 90s, the Labour Party was still the most important party in Scotland, both in the first elections of the Scottish Parliament. Labour got the most seats and formed the government for the first few years, and has also dominated the Scottish side of UK politics for generations. The parliamentary system over there is semi-proportional. There's 73 seats that are the first past the post system, like we still have here, and 56 members of the Scottish Parliament are elected through a proportional representation on a regional basis. There's 8 regions and each one has 7 seats. I found that out recently. And why do they have proportional representation but Westminster doesn't? You know, like, what was the logic behind that? The plan apparently was to make sure that the Scottish independentists would never have a majority. So there would never be even an attempt at creating an independent Scotland, counting on the division of the political scene into many sections. You know, it was seen as a bit of a safeguard that devolution would not eventually lead to independence. So that was up to the, you know, turn of the century. And then a bunch of things happened that changed that situation. Mostly what the Blair government did, with its neoliberal policies continuing and even going further than Thatcher on some fronts, like imposing tuition fees in universities, further privatizations of various public services. And I would say what really broke the camel's back was the invasion of Iraq and the role of the Blair government in that criminal operation. And that's when people like Kat and people in her generation got involved in politics. Was around that time, you know, 2002, 2003, the war in Iraq. So that meant that new generation of activists in Scotland, anyway, that's my analysis of it, you can correct me later, but it was the break, you know, like there was no longer an identification of progressive people, the younger progressive people, to the Labour Party in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK as well, but in Scotland it took eventually that national dimension that wasn't there in other parts of the UK. So after a few years of that Labour government, yeah, I'm going to try to finish that pretty soon. In 2007, the Scottish National Party won the election, but with a minority government. Already, it was a bit of a sign of danger for the political establishment in the UK. And on top of that, 2008, the financial crisis, you know, big upheaval, further round of cuts, conservative government that went even further than the previous Labour government. And then in 2011, the SNP won a majority, in spite of the fact that it was proportional representation. They got a majority of seats, and that's what started the whole process of having a referendum on independence, which took place in September 2014. So not too long ago. The question was, should Scotland be an independent country? It's a neat question. But again, the political establishment in London thought everything should be fine. Support for independence has never been above like 35%. You just have to do a bit of a decent campaign and everything should be fine. But as the campaign was going on, support for independence kept going up. And in the last few weeks of the campaign, there was, serious worry in Westminster that the SNP might actually win that referendum. It ended up being about 45% to 55%. The turnout was the most important in any election or referendum in the history of the UK since universal suffrage was introduced, with 84.6% participation. So I'm going to leave it to Kat to explain to you how we got there, and also what's next, and what role the left and radicals and progressives of various kinds played in that whole political phenomenon. And yeah, I think I've spoken enough, so there you go, Kat.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction. I've been starting my contributions to meetings like this since I've been here, with a little bit of a story about what happened in Scotland. Because when the SNP won that landslide, when they won that majority government, no one expected it. No one expected it. And two of the reasons, as Benoit has already outlined, one of them was to do with Blairism. One of them was to do with the Labour Party's attachment to neoliberalism, and the second was because when Labour had been in administration in Scotland, they had been awful. They have presided over some of the biggest financial scandals in Scotland, particularly over PFI scheme, I think it's PPP here. These huge schemes that are going to cost the ordinary people of Scotland billions and billions of pounds. So I keep getting this phrase in my head, and they say that history is written by those who are victorious, and I can't help but think, who's going to write the story of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum? Because on the 8th of May, just last month, Scotland elected 56 out of 59 pro-independence MPs to Westminster in the general election. The Scottish Nationalist Party in the previous Westminster government had 6 MPs, and in only 5 years they have wiped out the Labour Party north of the border, where the Labour Party thought they had a permanent right to rule. Let me be absolutely clear, Scotland has changed forever. Whilst I'm not a member of the Scottish Nationalist Party, I see that result, that victory, those 56 MPs, as a huge chance for a new left and the continuation of new politics in Scotland, and many of us are rising to that opportunity. So as Benoit has said, my first involvement in politics wasn't during the referendum. My support for independence came quite a few years before that, and it was a few days after my 18th birthday as I watched on television at my parents' house in a small town in Lanarkshire in the central belt of Scotland. And I will never ever forget that moment, because what I watched on television was the skies of Baghdad lighting up orange with bombs. And for a year before that happened, we had marched on the streets. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people had marched on the streets against the threat of an illegal invasion of Iraq. And we'd been ignored, the voice of the people ignored, in order to preserve the special relationship, the UK-US alliance. And it was during that time that many of us, my friends and my comrades, we began to question the deeper forces that surround the British state. And it was during that time that many of us became internationalists for independence. So when, in 2012, we knew for certain that there was going to be a referendum on Scotland's future, we saw a chance for Scotland to break away from Britain's failures. Because we looked around and all we saw was failure, not just internationally, but at home as well. We saw Britain failing economically, with both of the two main parties at Westminster promising to introduce the most brutal and humiliating austerity measures, declaring a war on women. Both Labour and the Conservatives promised to cut £10 billion from welfare, but pledged to spend £130 billion on Trident, the British state's nuclear weapons system. We saw Britain failing socially, with people increasingly being forced to live on the margins, relying on food banks and charity as the welfare state is being eroded and privatised. And we saw it failing politically too. The system of British politics that shuts out dissenting voices, the system where dissenting voices against austerity and war have nowhere to go and no one to represent them. And so, in 2012, we decided to build a movement for a radical independence from the grassroots, where we could challenge austerity and neoliberalism, and that's where the Radical Independence campaign began. So, I'll tell you a little bit about the Radical Independence campaign. It's a broad left-wing campaign. It's made up of socialists, trade unionists, environmentalists, anti-NATO nationalists, some people in a political party, some people in the SNP, some people in the Labour Party, some people who've never been involved in politics in their life, some people who've never even voted before. And we wanted to build a movement from the grassroots so that we could go out and convince people that voting yes had nothing to do with how Scottish you felt. It had nothing to do with a Scottish national identity. And we wanted to say that independence wasn't about the Scottish Nationalist Party either. And independence wasn't a case of taking down the Union Jack, the flag of the British state, from our buildings and replacing it with a Scottish saltire, but that instead voting yes and gaining independence was an opportunity to radically transform our lives, our futures. It was a chance to radically reorder society so that it represented the interests of the millions and not the millionaires at the top. A huge part of the radical independence campaign was our internationalism, our international links. That's why we had people from Quebec, Solidaire. That's why our first, second and third conference had a speaker from the Basque Country, from Catalonia, from Greece, from Palestine. Because we wanted to reach out to comrades, to trade unionists, to ordinary people across the world, and in England, Wales and Northern Ireland too. Because out of the current political settlement, the people who get the worst deal are ordinary people in England. As Benoit has said, we got a Scottish Parliament with some powers, not lots of economic powers, but some powers. The Welsh have an assembly, in Northern Ireland there's Stortman. But for ordinary people in England, all they have is Westminster. That's all they have to represent them. And we thought that the greatest act of solidarity was to gain independence, and that could strike a blow to that British political system, where you can change the colour of government, you can have Labour in charge or you can have the Tories in charge, but it doesn't really change that much, because the shadow forces that surround Westminster, the deepest and most reactionary elements of the British state, are unbreakable as long as that Parliament is there. I'm talking about its links with the City of London, its links with the arms trade, its relationship with apartheid states. We thought that a yes vote could break that settlement. Our referendum became synonymous with hope. A yes vote became synonymous with an opportunity for change. That idea that austerity at home and war abroad is not the best that you can expect. And we said that independence was a means. It was just a means, it was never ever the end goal. And over the last 2 years, our campaign went from strength to strength. And we took those so-called highest debates in politics about economic policy, foreign policy, corruption. We took those debates out into our working class communities that had been shut out for decades by both the Parliament at Holyrood, the Parliament in Edinburgh, and by Westminster as well. And we found that's what people wanted to talk about at the doorsteps. They wanted to talk about the war in Iraq. They wanted to talk about expenses scandals at Westminster. They wanted to talk about public sector cutbacks. We went out into those communities, and that's where our radical base grew. Voting yes became a revolt against those decades of alienation. All of this happened, and if you've ever seen the map of Scotland that shows you where voted yes, it happened in the Central Belt, in the Labour Party's heartlands. The Labour Party, which had once stood up for ordinary people, that had once had trade union values, was becoming a toxic brand, having betrayed ordinary people all too often. Independence, usually, on average, before the referendum, sits at about 20%. Before the referendum, it was seen as a bit of an eccentricity, a bit of a marginal phenomenon. But we took it to 45%. And see that extra 25% of people? They were the people that were the so-called disenfranchised. It was people in working class communities, it was women, it was people in our immigrant communities that made up that extra 25%. And I want to be honest, and I think that this is an important part of the story of the referendum. When we started radical independence, the momentum that grew behind it was partly created out of a frustration with the official Yes campaign. Because when they launched and they had their big platform launch, they said, vote yes and don't worry, nothing will really change that much. Vote yes and don't worry, you can keep the Queen. Vote yes and you can still keep the pound. And all that said to me was, vote yes and you can still be governed by a monarch and the Bank of England. That's not independence. And that was the opposite of what people wanted. People wanted a chance to rip up at the root the current economic and social settlement. Our campaign helped to convince those traditional Labour voters to vote yes, because it would open up a space for that radical change. And that's because, for the majority of us, the referendum itself was about class and democracy. And we saw that proven during the campaign, because it was the richest and most powerful people in our society who closed ranks and campaigned for a no vote. And this, I don't know how closely people followed it here, but the scare stories that we would get, like, you know, every single day, these scare stories that we get, the fear-mongering, behind the scenes, by the way, by the people who were in Better Together, which is the No campaign, behind the scenes, they called it Project Fear. This was a deliberate tactic to try and make people terrified of their own right to self-determination. And although we didn't win the referendum, we've won something else quite spectacular, because the referendum became the biggest self-education movement in Scotland's history. That grassroots campaign meant that there was meetings like this happening in every single town in Scotland, organised by the people who lived there. And when those fear stories were coming out in the press, people went online and discovered alternative news sources. People went to their local library and read the history of Scotland's oil. And I know more about Scotland's oil than I ever thought would be necessary. People went out and educated themselves, and then they took the arguments out into their communities, to their neighbours, to their families, to their colleagues. And that process of self-education has been so important. It's one of the things that is transforming Scotland still. Because the sum of all that learning means that it doesn't matter that we weren't educated at Eton like the majority of Conservative ministers. It doesn't matter that we weren't born into obscene privilege. We now have the knowledge to believe that we can rule ourselves better than any monarch or Westminster government ever could. A politically aware and politically educated population, that's what the elites fear most. Now, Scotland traditionally has the lowest voter turnout in Europe. There are council elections that don't even get above 20%. But through that campaign of popular education, through the voter registration drives that Radical Independence led, that changed the entire enfranchisement of people. And we proved that, see, when our votes actually matter, when they actually count, we'll turn up in our millions to participate in deciding our own future. The referendum became this popular people's movement for democracy against an archaic and reactionary state. And what happened in the UK general election last month is a consequence of all of this. And it's quite a mixed feeling what happened in the general election, because for our perceived obedience in voting no last September, we've been rewarded with arguably the most extreme Conservative government in living memory. Scotland now has one Liberal Democrat MP, one Labour MP and one Conservative MP. Because the Conservatives are in power at Westminster, that one Conservative MP is now the Secretary of State for Scotland. He has the power to influence and veto decisions about Scotland. It is a joke that anyone in Britain dare call it a modern democracy. But there is hope, because Scotland voted overwhelmingly for the SNP. And whether I believe them or not, they ran a campaign based on being anti-austerity, based on being anti-war, based on being anti-nuclear weapons. They were a product of the left-wing movement that's emerged over the last 2 years. That left-wing movement has pulled the SNP to the left, and the fact that they have been overwhelmingly elected in Scotland has shifted the political conversation. So it means for every time someone said that I'm a dreamer, or I'm an idealist, or that I just believe in a utopia because I think that austerity isn't necessary, the SNP just got 56 MPs based on that narrative. It's changed everything. And I was speaking to someone during my trip here who suggested that maybe Scotland's just, in our attitudes, maybe we're just a little bit more left-wing than everyone else in Britain. But I'm not so sure, because actually the biggest difference in Scotland is that because of the referendum, we've become used to countering the politics of fear that's peddled by the establishment. Because for over 700 days, we were told, if you dare to vote yes, you will lose your job, you will lose your home, you will lose your pension, you will lose your livelihood, you won't have enough food to eat. And yet 1.6 million people did it anyway. It was an act of genuine ambition instead of apprehension. We now have 1.6 million people in Scotland that do not believe a word of the mainstream media. And what's happening in Glasgow and Dundee is happening in Madrid and in Athens and in Dublin as well. The collapse of the Labour Party is the same as the collapse of their sister organisations across Europe. Formerly social democratic parties who, in making their pact with the neoliberal devil in the 1990s, were left without answers when the crisis came in 2008. It left the Labour Party in Scotland and the UK unable to provide a credible and coherent anti-austerity narrative in the general election campaign. And the movement that had emerged in Scotland over the 2 years before that punished them for the fact, and in fact seeing the Labour Party campaign side by side with the Conservatives, who are privatising the National Health Service in England, was the final nail in the coffin of the Labour Party north of the border. All across Europe, we're seeing the emergence of populist politics, and combined with a little bit of imagination and organisation, the left can frame that debate. And that's what happened in Scotland. The referendum broke open a stale and tribal politics, and we're experiencing this rebirth of radical ideas across the country. But of course there are differences too between Scotland and Europe. The main parties benefiting from that emergence of popular politics in Europe have far more leftist roots than the SNP do. I can't imagine Syriza or De Linke or Podemos advocating cuts in corporation tax, or routinely arming the police, or advocating membership of NATO, which are things that the SNP have done. The truth is the SNP are social liberals. You know, there's socialists in the SNP, there's social democrats, but at the core they're social liberals. They're anxious about nationalisation, they're weak on redistribution of wealth, but their election and their success means that there is a space opening up for something different. Radical independence is going to continue to be a radical campaign. With this Conservative government attacking our basic democratic rights, the first thing they wanted to do when they came into power was to tear up human rights legislation and replace it with a British Bill of Rights. That's the first thing they wanted to do. They're taking away our right to strike in public services. I've heard that's very familiar. This is what the Conservatives are going to do. Scotland needs an anti-austerity movement now more than ever. The promises that they are giving for more powers to the Scottish Parliament within them have the threat of austerity just being devolved as well. So radical independence is going to continue to be that movement on the streets. But in order to take the changes that we've experienced over the last 2 years and really entrench them in our society, to really sustain the momentum of our left-wing movement, we think that there needs to be an opening up of other ways to express our politics. The questions that we're asking ourselves is, how do we begin to democratise Scotland? How do we ensure that that high voter turnout, high participation at a community level continues? I mean, Scotland's got its own inequalities too. The elite Scots own about 260 times more wealth than the bottom 10% in Scottish society, a product of the UK being the fourth most unequal country in the developed world. We want to make sure that there's never another generation that feels that they have no say in their own future. And it was the differences between radical independence and the official Yes campaign that really built this groundswell of support for independence. The radical independence campaign has shown that a potential new left force exists in Scotland, and we now want to bind not just the old left together, but to pull in the new left that has emerged across the country. If we come together as a combined electoral option on the same working terms as we did during the referendum, we could quickly become Scotland's second political force, displacing Labour's link with the trade unions, giving political power back to thousands of people who are trapped in chronic, low-paid, precarious work. We could quickly become the official opposition to the SNP as a pro-independence party, so that independence becomes normalised at Holyrood, and we're actually focusing on the issues that are going to affect people's lives in Scotland, whether there's a referendum or not. Brave decisions could make Scotland into a legitimate alternative to the neoliberal centre of British politics, and I think we're moving in the right direction. Some of us involved in radical independence, some members of Syriza, who now live in Scotland, a branch of Podemos, who are in Edinburgh. We have a huge Spanish community in Edinburgh. Some artists, some great Scottish writers, and the former deputy leader of the SNP have all come together to create the Scottish Left project. And that's a project to try and present a credible left alternative at the ballot box in 2016. The Scottish Socialist Party, which once had 6 MSPs, have come into that project now as well, and we're having negotiations about how to present this option next year. I think it's important though to remember that there is more to politics than just elections. Electoral politics for me are only a part of the solution to transformational change. The decentralisation of decision making and social movements still matter. In fact, they're really, really important. But as we're proving in Scotland, you can try and have both of these things at the same time, the movement on the street and its representation at the ballot box as well. So over the coming year, we're going to be continuing radical independence, and at our last conference we pledged a people's vow on the points that we are going to campaign on, and that's anti-austerity, anti-privatisation, fighting fracking, campaigning against TTIP, the new trade deal between the US and Europe. And we called it the People's Vow because towards the end of the referendum campaign, the 3 leaders of the Westminster parties made their own vow on the front page of one of our tabloid newspapers, and I still don't accept that they had the best interests of the people in Scotland at heart. So we're moving forward in trying to present this option on our ballot paper in 2016, and we're still having a social movement that's going to challenge elites in Scotland and the rest of the UK. Because even though the referendum is over for now, we still believe in our original campaign slogan for radical independence, one that we borrowed from the anti-globalisation movement, that another Scotland is possible, and that's what we want, no matter whether there's another referendum or not. Thank you.